The snow fell in thick, silent curtains over the parking lot of the Meijer supermarket on the outskirts of Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was December 3rd, 2010, and the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The fluorescent lights from the store cast long yellow shadows across the fresh powder, illuminating the few cars still scattered across the lot at 9:47 in the evening. Among them sat a blue 2004 Honda Civic, its windshield already covered with a layer of white that obscured the empty driver's seat inside. The engine was off. The keys were gone. And so was 23-year-old Jessica Marie Hartwell. Inside the store, her shopping cart sat abandoned in aisle 7, halfway between the cereal and the pasta, a box of Cheerios, 2 cans of tomato sauce, a bag of apples, the ordinary purchases of an ordinary Friday night. But Jessica would never come back to collect them. Her phone, which she'd been using to text her roommate just minutes before, lay face down on the passenger seat of her car, its screen dark, the last message incomplete. "Be home in 20 May." The sentence ended there, suspended in time, forever unfinished. The store's security camera had captured her walking toward the exit at 9:32, her arms full of grocery bags, her breath visible in the frigid air. She wore a navy blue winter coat, jeans and snow boots. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She was smiling, or at least not frowning, moving with the casual ease of someone who had no reason to believe this night would be different from any other. The camera watched her push through the automatic doors. It watched her walk toward her car. And then, at the edge of the frame, where the parking lot lights began to fade into darkness, it watched her disappear. No scream, no struggle visible. Just there one moment and then not there the next, swallowed by the falling snow and the winter night. If my story resonates with you, please hit the like button to bring a little light to this father's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss my upcoming life stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me so happy to know what corner of the country or world you're listening from. Jessica Marie Hartwell was born on April 14, 1987, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, to Robert and Diane Hartwell. She was their only child, and from the moment she came into the world, she brought light into their lives. Diane, a high school English teacher, would later say that Jessica had been a miracle baby, arriving after years of fertility struggles and failed attempts. Robert, who worked as an electrician, called her his little spark. She grew up in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, with a tire swing in the backyard and a golden retriever named Buster, who followed her everywhere. By all accounts, Jessica was a bright, creative child who loved to read and write stories. She kept journals filled with poems and short fiction, and in high school she served as editor of the school newspaper. Her teachers remembered her as thoughtful and driven, the kind of student who stayed after class to ask questions and genuinely cared about learning. She had dreams of becoming a journalist, of traveling the world and telling stories that mattered. After graduating from Kalamazoo Central High School in 2005, she enrolled at Grand Valley State University, where she majored in communications. Grand Rapids in 2010 was a city in transition. The Great Recession had hit Michigan hard, and the automotive industry's collapse had sent shockwaves through every community in the state. But Grand Rapids, with its diverse economy and strong community ties, was fighting back. Downtown was undergoing revitalization. Art galleries and coffee shops were opening. There was hope in the air, even as unemployment remained high and families struggled. Jessica had moved there after college, finding work as a marketing coordinator for a small non-profit that helped homeless youth. She shared an apartment with her best friend from college, Amy Richardson, in the Heritage Hill neighborhood. It was an old Victorian home converted into units with creaky floors and radiators that clanged in the night. Jessica loved it. She was building a life, one small step at a time, in a city she'd grown to adore. That Friday night in December, Jessica had left work around 5:30, as she usually did. She'd stopped by the apartment to drop off her laptop and change out of her work clothes. Amy was visiting her parents in Detroit for the weekend, so Jessica had the place to herself. She'd decided to run to the store for groceries, planning to make spaghetti and settle in for a quiet evening. She'd called her mother around 7 just to chat, telling Diane about her week and making plans to come home to Kalamazoo for Christmas, which was only 3 weeks away. Diane would replay that conversation in her mind thousands of times in the years to come, searching for any hint, any warning sign that something was wrong. But there had been nothing. Jessica had sounded happy, relaxed. She'd laughed when Diane told her about Buster stealing a ham sandwich off the counter. They'd said, "I love you," before hanging up. It was the last time Diane heard her daughter's voice. The Meijer supermarket sat on Alpine Avenue, a busy commercial strip lined with big-box stores and chain restaurants. It was a place Jessica visited regularly, familiar and safe. She'd parked in her usual spot, not too far from the entrance, under one of the tall light poles that illuminated the lot. The store was moderately busy that evening, with holiday shoppers starting to stock up for the season. Jessica had walked the aisles with her list, selecting items methodically. Several people who were in the store that night would later tell police they'd seen her, though none of them noticed anything unusual. She was just another shopper, moving through her routine, invisible in her ordinariness. But somewhere between the automatic doors of that grocery store and her Honda Civic, Jessica's life intersected with evil. The disappearance wasn't immediately obvious. When Amy returned to the apartment on Sunday afternoon, she assumed Jessica was out. The groceries never arrived, but Amy thought perhaps Jessica had changed her plans, maybe gone out with friends or decided to visit her parents. It wasn't until Sunday evening, when she tried calling Jessica's phone repeatedly and got no answer, that a small seed of worry began to grow. By Monday morning, when Jessica didn't show up for work and her phone continued to go straight to voicemail, Amy knew something was very wrong. She drove to the Meijer, though she wasn't sure why, some instinct pulling her there. And that's when she saw it. The blue Honda Civic, still sitting in the parking lot, now covered with several days' worth of snow and ice. Her heart dropped. Amy called the police at 10:15 on Monday morning, December 6, 2010. 2 patrol officers arrived within 20 minutes. They ran the license plate, confirmed the car belonged to Jessica Hartwell, and immediately escalated the case. The car was locked, showing no signs of forced entry. But when they finally got inside, using the spare key Amy retrieved from the apartment, they found Jessica's purse on the passenger seat. Her wallet was there, with her driver's license, credit cards, and $43 in cash. Her phone was there. Her keys were not. The groceries she'd purchased were not in the car. It was as if she'd loaded the bags, put her purse inside, and then simply vanished before she could start the engine and drive away. The Grand Rapids Police Department launched an immediate investigation. Detective Sarah Kowalski, a 15-year veteran with the department, was assigned as the lead investigator. She was a meticulous woman, known for her refusal to give up on cases, and from the moment she arrived at that parking lot and saw the abandoned car, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. Missing persons cases were always difficult, particularly when the victim was a young woman. The first 72 hours were critical, and they'd already lost 3 days. The store's security footage became the central focus of the initial investigation. Detectives spent hours reviewing every angle, every camera. They watched Jessica enter the store. They watched her shop. They watched her check out at Register 4 at 9:28, making small talk with the cashier about the snow. They watched her exit the building, carrying 2 plastic bags. And then they watched the parking lot footage, grainy and poorly lit, where Jessica walked toward her car, reached it, appeared to open the trunk to load the groceries, and then, as she moved around to the driver's side, something happened just beyond the clear view of the camera. There was movement, shadows, and then Jessica was gone. The car's trunk remained open for approximately 45 seconds before someone, a figure whose features couldn't be distinguished in the low light and falling snow, closed it. Then nothing. The car sat there, and the parking lot returned to its quiet, snow-covered emptiness. Who was that figure? Detectives enhanced the footage, brought in specialists, tried every technological method available in 2010 to identify the person. But the image quality was too poor, the lighting too dim, the snow too heavy. They could determine it was likely a male based on build and height, but beyond that, they had nothing definitive. It was ghost-like, this figure who had taken Jessica, appearing and disappearing like smoke. Meanwhile, Robert and Diane Hartwell were living through every parent's worst nightmare. They drove to Grand Rapids the moment Amy called them on Monday, their world collapsing with each mile. Diane kept calling Jessica's phone, even though it went straight to voicemail, leaving messages that became increasingly desperate. "Baby, please call me. Please, wherever you are, just call. We love you. We're not mad. Just come home." Robert sat rigid in the driver's seat, his jaw clenched, tears streaming silently down his face. When they arrived at the police station and Detective Kowalski explained what they knew so far, which was heartbreakingly little, Diane collapsed. She simply folded into herself, a keening sound emerging from somewhere deep in her chest that Robert had never heard before and would never forget. The first week of the investigation was a whirlwind of activity. Police canvassed the entire area around the Maya, going door to door, questioning anyone who might have been in the vicinity that Friday night. They interviewed Jessica's co-workers, her friends, her ex-boyfriends. They looked into her finances, her phone records, her email accounts, searching for any indication that she'd been planning to leave or that she'd been in contact with someone who might wish her harm. They found nothing suspicious. Jessica's life was an open book, and every page told the same story of a young woman who was exactly who she appeared to be: kind, responsible, loved, and loved by others. The media picked up the story quickly. Missing, Jessica Hartwell, 23, became a fixture on local news broadcasts. Her photo, a beautiful picture from a friend's wedding where she wore a lavender dress and was mid-laugh, filled television screens across West Michigan. The community rallied. Volunteers organized search parties, combing through parks, wooded areas, and vacant lots in the bitter December cold. They posted flyers on every telephone pole, in every store window, in every public space they could find. Jessica's face was everywhere, her dark eyes staring out from those posters, asking silently, "Have you seen me?" Robert and Diane stayed in Grand Rapids, unable to return home, unable to do anything but search for their daughter. They gave press conferences, their faces haggard with grief and lack of sleep, pleading for information. "If someone has Jessica, please let her go," Diane said, her voice breaking. "She's our whole world. Please." They set up a tip line, offering a reward that grew from $5,000 to $25,000 as friends and community members contributed. But the tips that came in led nowhere. Dozens of reported sightings, all of which turned out to be other young women who happened to have dark hair. Theories and speculation, most of which fell apart under investigation. The trail was cold before it had ever really been warm. Christmas came and went. The Hartwells didn't celebrate. They couldn't. Jessica's presents sat unwrapped under a tree they hadn't bothered to decorate. Her stocking hung empty. Diane sat in Jessica's childhood bedroom for hours, holding her daughter's old teddy bear, breathing in the faint scent of her that still lingered on the stuffed animal. Robert threw himself into the search with manic energy, refusing to accept what he feared in his heart. He created a website dedicated to finding Jessica, updating it daily with news and information. He printed thousands more flyers. He drove the streets of Grand Rapids at all hours, looking, always looking, as if he might spot her walking down some sidewalk, as if this nightmare might somehow end with a simple reunion. But Jessica didn't come home. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The intensive media coverage began to fade as other stories took precedence. The volunteers who had searched so diligently in December returned to their own lives. The case remained open, but Detective Kowalski had to admit privately that leads had dried up. Without a body, without a clear suspect, without any physical evidence beyond that grainy security footage, the investigation had stalled. Jessica Hartwell had become another statistic, another missing person in a country where hundreds of thousands of people are reported missing every year. The second year was harder than the first. In the first year, there'd been the frantic energy of the search, the belief that at any moment there might be a breakthrough. But as 2011 wore on, a different kind of reality set in. This might never be solved. Jessica might never be found. That truth was a weight that pressed down on the Hartwells with crushing force. Diane took a leave of absence from her teaching job. She couldn't stand in front of a classroom and pretend that life was normal when her daughter was gone. She couldn't read poetry about hope and joy when she felt neither of those things. She spent her days in a kind of fugue state, moving through the motions of living without actually being present in her life. Robert continued working, needing the structure, but everyone at his job knew. They saw it in his eyes, the way he'd aged 10 years in 10 months. They heard it in his voice when he had to take calls from Detective Kowalski, still checking in regularly, though she had little new to report. The men he worked with, rough electricians who weren't much for emotional conversations, would sometimes find ways to help without making a fuss. They'd show up at his house to fix things without being asked. They'd invite him to have a beer after work, not to talk, just to sit. It was their way of saying, "We see your pain, you're not alone." Amy Richardson, Jessica's roommate and best friend, was drowning in guilt. She replayed that weekend endlessly. If she hadn't gone to Detroit, if she'd been home when Jessica went to the store, if she'd gone with her. The ifs were endless and torturous. She went to therapy, but it didn't help much. How could a therapist understand this specific kind of loss, this specific kind of what if? She kept Jessica's bedroom exactly as it had been, unable to pack up her friends' belongings, unable to accept that Jessica wasn't coming back to need them. She'd sit in there sometimes on Jessica's bed and just talk to her, telling her about her day, about what was happening in the world, as if Jessica might somehow hear her wherever she was. The 3rd anniversary of Jessica's disappearance brought a renewed media push. Detective Kowalski, who had never stopped working the case even as her caseload grew, gave interviews reminding the public that Jessica was still missing, that the investigation was still active, that someone out there knew something. The Hartwells held a candlelight vigil at the Meijer parking lot, right where Jessica's car had been found. Dozens of people came, friends and strangers alike, standing in the December cold with flickering candles, singing Amazing Grace and holding signs that read, "Justice for Jessica and never forgotten." But as the years continued to pass, hope became harder to maintain. 2014 came and went. 2015. Diane kept Jessica's room exactly as it had been. She left the porch light on every single night, a beacon for a daughter who might somehow find her way home. She kept Jessica's phone number active, paying the bill month after month, leaving voicemail messages on her daughter's birthday and Christmas, and random Tuesdays when the grief was too much to bear. Robert built a memorial garden in their backyard, planting Jessica's favorite flowers, purple irises that bloomed every spring. He'd sit out there for hours, talking to his daughter, telling her about his day, asking her where she was, begging her to give them a sign. Detective Kowalski kept the case file on her desk, never filed away, never forgotten. She'd pull it out regularly, reviewing every detail, looking for something she might have missed. She attended conferences on cold cases, learning new techniques, new technologies. She never gave up, but she also didn't have answers. The DNA they'd collected from Jessica's car had been tested and retested, but it only showed Jessica's DNA and Amy's, which made sense since Amy was frequently in the car. There were no unknown fingerprints. No witnesses had ever come forward with useful information. It was as if Jessica had been taken by a ghost. Then, in the spring of 2017, something happened that would change everything. A man named David Thornton was arrested in Lansing, Michigan, for the attempted kidnapping of a young woman in a parking lot. The victim fought back, screaming and scratching, and Thornton fled, but not before security cameras captured clear footage of him and his vehicle. Police arrested him within 48 hours. During the investigation of Thornton's background, detectives discovered he had an extensive history of violence against women, including assault charges that had been pleaded down over the years. He'd lived in Grand Rapids in 2010. He'd worked as a night shift stocker at a warehouse just 2 miles from the Meijer, where Jessica had vanished. Detective Kowalski got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. A detective from Lansing was going through Thornton's history, looking for possible connections to unsolved cases, and Jessica's name had come up. Kowalski's heart began to pound. She immediately drove to Lansing to join the investigation. Thornton had been using a white work van in 2010, a vehicle he'd since sold. Police tracked down the van, now owned by a contractor in Flint. They seized it and processed it for evidence. And there, after all these years, they found something. In the cargo area of the van, beneath newer carpeting that had been installed by subsequent owners, forensic technicians discovered biological evidence: hair, fibers, and most crucially, a small bloodstain that had seeped into the metal floor beneath the carpet. The DNA from that bloodstain was tested and compared to Jessica's DNA profile, which had been on file since 2010. It was a match. After 7 years of searching, of wondering, of hoping against hope, they had physical evidence that Jessica Hartwell had been in David Thornton's van. The relief that washed over Detective Kowalski was mixed with profound sadness, because she knew what this likely meant. If Jessica's blood was in that van, she had been injured. If she had been in that van, she had been taken against her will. And if she had been gone all these years with no contact, the chances that she was still alive were vanishingly small. Kowalski had to make the call to Robert and Diane that every detective dreads and every family of a missing person both yearns for and fears. "We have a suspect," she told them. "We have evidence. We're moving forward." The Hartwells held each other and wept. Relief and horror and grief all tangled together. A suspect meant answers might finally come. But answers might also mean confirmation of their deepest fear. David Thornton, when interrogated, initially denied everything. He claimed he'd never seen Jessica, didn't know who she was, had no idea how her DNA could have gotten into his old van. But detectives had more than just the biological evidence. They had his work schedule from 2010, which showed he'd been off work that Friday night. They had tow records showing his van passing through an interchange near the Maya around the time of Jessica's disappearance. They had witness statements from co-workers who described him as strange, aggressive, someone who made crude comments about women. The circumstantial evidence was building, and Thornton's lawyer knew it. After 3 days of interrogation, with the evidence mounting and his legal options narrowing, David Thornton finally broke. In a recorded confession that would later be played in court, he admitted to abducting Jessica Hartwell. He'd been in the Maya parking lot that night, he said, sitting in his van, watching women come and go. It was something he did, he admitted with chilling casualness, a kind of game, watching and fantasizing. When he saw Jessica alone loading groceries into her car, something in him snapped. He got out of his van and approached her. He had a knife. He told her if she screamed, he'd use it. He forced her into his van. She'd fought, he said. She'd scratched his face, and that's when he'd struck her with the knife handle, hard enough to draw blood and daze her. He drove her to a remote wooded area in Ottawa County, about 40 minutes north of Grand Rapids. What happened in those woods, Thornton would only describe in the briefest terms. He assaulted her, he said. When she continued to fight and scream despite his threats, he panicked. He strangled her until she stopped moving. Then, realizing what he'd done, he buried her in a shallow grave and covered the site with branches and leaves. He returned to his normal life, he said, and tried to forget about it. When he saw the news coverage of Jessica's disappearance, he was terrified at first, but as days and then weeks passed with no arrest, he began to believe he'd gotten away with it. Detective Kowalski, listening to this confession, felt sick, but she kept her composure, kept asking questions. "Where exactly did you bury her?" she asked. Thornton provided directions, landmarks. He drew a crude map. 2 days later, on a grey morning in May 2017, police and forensic teams converged on a wooded area off a rural road in Ottawa County. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and archaeological excavation tools. It took 6 hours of careful searching, but they found her. Jessica Marie Hartwell, who had been missing for 6 years and 5 months, was finally coming home. The remains were badly decomposed, reduced largely to bones and remnants of clothing, but dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. This was Jessica. The forensic examination would show evidence consistent with Thornton's confession: trauma to the skull from a blunt object, damage to the hyoid bone consistent with strangulation. She'd been killed the same night she disappeared, or very shortly after. She'd never had a chance to escape, never had a chance to survive. Whatever hope the Hartwells had secretly, impossibly held on to for all these years was extinguished completely. The call to tell them their daughter's body had been found was the hardest conversation Detective Kowalski had ever had in her career. Diane's wail of anguish echoed through the phone line, a sound of pure, unfiltered grief that Kowalski would hear in her nightmares for years to come. Robert, who had held himself together through sheer force of will for so long, crumbled. He couldn't speak, could only sob deep, gasping sobs that shook his entire body. Their daughter was dead. She had been dead all along. The years of searching, of hoping, of lighting candles and planting flowers and keeping her room ready, all of it had been for someone who was already gone. But there was also, buried beneath the grief, a strange kind of relief. They knew now. The not knowing had been its own special torture, and as terrible as this truth was, it was still truth. They could bury their daughter. They could say goodbye. They could perhaps eventually begin to heal, though neither of them could imagine what that healing might look like. Jessica's funeral was held on a Saturday in June, 7 years after she should have been laid to rest. The church was packed with hundreds of people, friends and family and community members, who had never even met Jessica, but had carried her story in their hearts all this time. Diane gave a eulogy, her voice steady though her hands shook. She talked about Jessica's laugh, about her kindness, about her dreams of being a journalist and making the world better. She talked about the girl who had loved to read and write, who had once rescued a baby bird and nursed it back to health in a shoebox, who had believed in the goodness of people even when people didn't deserve that belief. "My daughter should be here," Diane said, looking out at the congregation. "She should be 30 years old, maybe married, maybe thinking about giving us grandchildren. She should be writing stories and changing the world. But she's not. Because someone took that future away from her, away from us, and that's something we'll carry for the rest of our lives." David Thornton was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct. The trial began in November 2017 and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The DNA in the van, the confession, the recovery of Jessica's body exactly where Thornton had said it would be. The defense tried to argue that the confession had been coerced, that Thornton had been under duress, but the jury didn't buy it. They'd seen the tape of the interrogation. They'd heard Thornton's cold, matter-of-fact tone as he described what he'd done. After just 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the Hartwells were given the opportunity to address their daughter's killer. Robert stood at the podium, looking directly at Thornton, who sat impassively at the defense table. "You stole my daughter's life," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stole her future, her dreams, everything she could have been. You stole 7 years of not knowing, 7 years of torture for our family. I hope you spend every day of the rest of your life thinking about what you did. I hope you never know peace." Diane couldn't speak. She stood beside her husband, tears streaming down her face, holding a framed photo of Jessica, the same photo from the missing persons posters that had been everywhere in those early days. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced David Thornton to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away, Thornton looked back once at the Hartwells. There was no remorse on his face, no apology, just a blank stare. Then he was gone, and for the first time in 7 years, Robert and Diane could breathe a little easier, knowing that justice, at least in its legal form, had been served. The years that followed were about rebuilding, about learning to live in a world where Jessica was gone but no longer missing. The Hartwells moved from Kalamazoo to a smaller town in northern Michigan, unable to stay in the house where they'd raised Jessica, where every room held memories that were now too painful. They started a foundation in Jessica's name, dedicated to helping families of missing persons and funding advanced DNA testing for cold cases. Diane eventually returned to teaching, finding purpose in shaping young minds the way she'd once shaped her daughters. Robert retired from electrical work and volunteered with search and rescue organizations, wanting to help bring other families the closure he'd finally received. They learned to live with the grief, though it never disappeared. It became part of them, woven into the fabric of their daily existence. They marked Jessica's birthday every year with a celebration of her life, gathering with friends and family to share memories and keep her spirit alive. They visited her grave regularly, bringing purple irises, sitting beside the headstone that read, Jessica Marie Hartwell, 1987-2010, beloved daughter, dreamer, light of our lives. Detective Sarah Kowalski retired in 2020 after 32 years with the Grand Rapids Police Department. Jessica's case was one of her proudest achievements, not because she wanted glory, but because she'd gotten answers for a family that deserved them. She'd brought a dangerous predator to justice and prevented him from hurting anyone else. At her retirement party, Robert and Diane Hartwell were there, presenting her with a framed photo of Jessica and a plaque that read, To Detective Kowalski, who never gave up on our daughter. With eternal gratitude and love, the Hartwell family. Amy Richardson eventually moved away from Grand Rapids, the city holding too many ghosts. She became a victim's advocate, working with families affected by violent crime, channeling her grief and guilt into helping others navigate the impossible. She kept Jessica's photo on her desk, a reminder of why she did the work she did, a reminder that every case was someone's daughter, someone's best friend, someone who mattered. The case of Jessica Hartwell serves as both a tragedy and a testament to perseverance. It's a reminder that cold cases can be solved, that advances in DNA technology and dedicated law enforcement can bring answers even years after a crime. It's also a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the most ordinary places, in parking lots and grocery stores where we never expect evil to find us. Jessica was doing nothing more than buying groceries on a Friday night, living her life, pursuing her dreams. She should have been safe. She should have made it home. But she didn't. And while David Thornton sits in a prison cell for the rest of his life, Jessica remains frozen at 23, forever young, forever full of potential that will never be realized. Her story doesn't have a happy ending. There is no redemption, no silver lining that can make the horror of what happened to her any less horrific. But there is closure. There is justice. There is a family that, while broken, has found a way to continue living, to honor their daughter's memory, to make sure she is never forgotten. The light that Diane Hartwell kept on for all those years, the porch light that burned through every night of Jessica's absence, finally went dark after her funeral. But in its place, something else emerged. A different kind of light, one powered not by electricity but by memory, by love, by the determination to make meaning from meaningless tragedy. The foundation they created has helped dozens of families. The advocacy work inspired by Jessica's case has led to legislative changes in how missing persons cases are handled. Her story, as painful as it is, has made a difference. Tonight, somewhere in America, another mother is leaving a light on for a daughter who hasn't come home. Another father is searching streets and highways, looking for a face he knows he might never see again. Another family is living in the limbo of not knowing, that special hell that the Hartwells inhabited for 7 years. Missing persons cases are more common than most people realize, with over 600,000 reported in the United States each year. Most are resolved quickly, but thousands are not. Thousands of families wait and wonder and hope and grieve simultaneously. If Jessica's story teaches us anything, it's to be vigilant, to be aware, to understand that danger can appear in the most unexpected moments. It's to never give up on the missing, to keep searching, keep hoping, keep demanding answers. It's to support the families left behind, to remember that behind every statistic is a person, a life, a story that mattered. It's to push for better resources for law enforcement, for better technology, for better training in handling these heartbreaking cases. And it's to remember Jessica Marie Hartwell, not as a victim, not as a cold case file, but as a young woman with dreams and aspirations, with a bright future stolen from her, with parents who loved her more than life itself, with friends who still miss her laugh, with a community that will never forget her name. She was here. She mattered. And though her life was cut tragically short, her memory continues to inspire change, to push for justice, to light the way for others, searching in the darkness for loved ones who are gone. The snow still falls in Grand Rapids on December nights, just as it did that evening in 2010. The Maya still stands on Alpine Avenue, its parking lot still illuminated by tall light poles. People still shop there, loading groceries into their cars, going about their ordinary lives, mostly unaware of the tragedy that unfolded there years ago. But for those who remember, for those who knew Jessica, that parking lot is hallowed ground, a place where an ordinary errand became the last moments of a beautiful life, where a daughter told her mother she'd be home in 20 minutes and then vanished into the winter night. Rest in peace, Jessica Marie Hartwell. You were loved. You are remembered, and your light, though extinguished far too soon, continues to shine through the lives you touched and the justice your story finally found.